Right, Lyndon Johnson, long-serving senator from the state of Texas, vice president to John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and elevated to the presidency after 1963 and the assassination of Kennedy, elected to his own term in the presidency in 1964. Remember, that was the Barry Goldwater event. Remember the video we saw? 10, 9, 8, we must love one another or die. Okay, whatever works, I guess, right? Okay, we're on the top of page 3, ladies and gentlemen, and we are attempting to make our way through Lyndon Johnson here, and then on to Richard Nixon as well. So, Lyndon Johnson. At the top of the page, we're asked about the Great Society. Johnson believes that America is an important moment. We have this enormous potential energy that comes from the death and the loss of President Kennedy. Johnson convinces the American people that Kennedy would have wanted America to put a stamp on the society of this age, and that stamp is going to be the Great Society, not just a wealthy society, not just a prosperous, victorious society, but a great society, one in which every American life is a quality existence. Now, we've seen this kind of an idea before to some extent. The Square Deal under Teddy Roosevelt, the First New Deal, the Second New Deal, both under Franklin Roosevelt, okay? And then the Fair Deal under Harry Truman, which didn't do very well, unfortunately. And this is the latest and the greatest of the ideas, a permanent long-term improvement in the average American life. Now, the first few programs of the Great Society we have here don't really cost a lot of money, but they are very far-reaching. Let's have a look. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 bans discrimination in public places. The Voting Rights Act ends literacy taxes, and the 24th Amendment bans poll taxes. Together, those three basically eliminate the Jim Crow notion of the South, the separate but equal society that had existed since the Civil War and had really been legally verified by the Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal language. With those three laws, the federal government is saying, enough malarkey. We're the United States of America. And if we are going to go all around the planet advertising and pushing the notion of democracy, then doggone it, we're going to do it in our own South. And we're going to use the federal government's enforcement powers to make sure that if you're a citizen of this country and you're of the right age, then you're going to vote if you want to vote. Forget the literacy tests, forget the poll taxes and all of these other loopholes. Let's do this right. And that's what the government's going to try and do. Now, the other programs we've listed might cost some money. Medicare and Medicaid, providing medical aid to the poor and to the elderly. We also have to keep in mind there are programs here like AFDC. There's some Head Start initiatives. There's a lot of programs that are going to spend government cash to try and improve the poverty level. This is also kind of called the war on poverty. Now, unfortunately for Johnson, this is not all going to work out well. And one of the reasons is Vietnam. Johnson's spending on average $22 billion a year in Vietnam, and he's spending about $1.2 billion a year on the Great Society. Hence the old adage that the Great Society was shot down over the fields of Vietnam. Sad. Okay. On top of that, the Democratic Party continues to be a real interesting party. You have, on one hand, African Americans who, starting in 1936, began voting for the Democratic Party. But you also have Southern whites, who more and more are becoming aggravated by the Democratic Party's support for African Americans. So the Southern whites of the party, in a way, have to be appeased, and Johnson is a little nervous here about pushing too much with civil rights, and therefore he might be holding back a little bit here to assure that we hold on to both of those constituencies. Now, in the long run, the Democratic Party cannot serve both of those groups. And as we get into the later 1960s, we'll see those Southern whites break away from the Democratic Party. But Johnson's Great Society also upsets groups like the American Medical Association, who see his meddling in healthcare as being something that the government should not be doing. Healthcare, always a controversial topic, it seems. Okay? Moving down the list here, we talk about the credibility gap. This is where it really starts to shake the foundations of society. The credibility gap is the idea that the government isn't necessarily telling us everything we need to know. And that, especially when it comes to Vietnam, that we're not doing as well as we think we're doing. That Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, keeps going back to Vietnam, and every time he comes back, he says, you know what? We're winning the war. That's right, we're winning the war. And yet, at every turn, when we read the newspaper, And when we see the morale of the soldiers, we get the real sense that we're not winning the war. And so we begin to wonder, if the government's willing to lie to us about a war and the results of that war, what else might it be willing to lie to us about? And that begins this really tumultuous age in the 1960s. The next question is about the youth. And the protest movements of the 60s really begin among the youth. The college campuses, a group called Students for a Democratic Society, founded at the University of Michigan, which protests the involvement in Vietnam, the ideas of American society, the direction of foreign policy, the morals of their parents, really a rejection of what we might call the middle-class America that had raised them. Okay, these are groups that are going to take civil rights tactics, sit-ins, marches, teach-ins, non-violent for the most part, unless we're burning down ROTC buildings apparently, in order to make sure that the group gets its word out there. College campuses become real hotbeds for the liberal movement of the age. Okay, moving along here. Okay, what role did the Black Panthers play in the African American civil rights movement? By the mid to late 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr.'s message of nonviolence and patience is not ringing clearly in everyone's ears. There are some groups in American society who have begun to believe that it is time for a more aggressive path. Groups like the Panthers, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, founders of the group, believe that a little bit of violence, and this is an early doctrine, when it confronts violence is perfectly acceptable, that you have a right to stand up for who you are and not to be pushed around, especially by white police officers. Now, in the long run, the group's going to denounce that violence plank and move towards more aggressive but not violent ways of trying to move civil rights along. The important idea, though, is that we're splintering. That movement that Martin Luther King Jr. had that was a unified front, not anymore. Moving down, we'll see other groups begin their push for civil rights. MAPA, the Mexican American Political Association, trying to get Hispanics elected to office. The Brown Berets, kind of a model of the Black Panthers, a group that was willing to commit the acts of violence, if violence were pushed on them, in order to stand up for their rights. Cesar Chavez, we talked about Cesar Chavez right here in our own backyard in Delano, standing up for migrant and immigrant farm workers and the rights of laborers against the fruit growing companies, and really drawing national attention with Bobby Kennedy coming out here. The American Indian movement shows that if we can have, black power, and if we can have brown power, then there's red power as well. The American Indian movement took over Alcatraz, and for 18 months held onto the island and refused to give it back. Now, sadly, the federal government really wasn't that interested in it at that point, and after 18 months they left. But this is an age of activism, and everybody's activism-ing, if that's a word. Okay, down to the women. Okay, how is this a different moment for women? Well, this is a generation of women that's going to go to college more. They're going to work outside the home more, especially after marriage, and they're going to have less kids. Now, if you're a traditional family conservative, this is the moment where you think American society kind of left the rails. When we changed the gender roles, when women stopped being the primarily domestics, and when they became people who were balancing kind of the mommy life and the working life and the career and all the stress that goes with it, then the fabric of the family society was ripped in two, never to be put together again. Okay. Some of the things that we see on the list here, the feminine mystique, which we talked about in our last unit, so that's back there. Rachel Carlson talks about the ways in which American society is poisoning the groundwater with pesticides. Title IX, an NCAA ruling which provides that you have to have equal opportunities for female athletes on college campuses, and not just athletes, but the overall college experience. The ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, which really would have capped off the feminist movement of the day by adding an amendment to the Constitution that said women are equal to men. Now, there's enough conservative interest in America that this doesn't end up in the Constitution. It's one of those amendments that doesn't get enough states passing it. And part of the problem is sort of deep southern states who don't want to agree to it, but also individuals who are a little bit worried about the legal equalifying of men and women and where that might go. That is to say, are we opening the door here to homosexual relationships? Are we opening the door here to changing the whole idea of gender in the country? And people aren't completely comfortable with that. The most eventful year, though, of Lyndon Johnson's presidency is 1968. And in 1968, the country completely comes to tatters. Okay? Tet Offensive. During the Tet, or Vietnamese New Year of January 1968, the Vietnamese staged this enormous attack on the forces of America in South Vietnam. It's the sort of attack that if you're losing a war, you don't wage. But clearly, they're not losing the war. The number of Americans supporting the war in January and the number of supporting it in May are drastically different, right? People are going to change their minds about the Vietnam War because, wait a second, I thought we were winning. We're not. Huh? March 31st that year, Lyndon Johnson gets on the TV and says, you know what, ladies and gentlemen? I'm not running again. You thought I was going to run. I can run. I'm the Democratic incumbent for this job, and I look like I've got a pretty good chance of winning, but we got to fix the problems of the society. And Johnson basically says, I got 9 months. I want to fix the Great Society. I want to fix the Vietnam issue, and in 9 months I'm going to take care of it. That opens up the Democratic Party race. We'll talk about it in a minute. 5 days later, April 4th, Martin Luther King Jr. is shot. So keep in mind, this is a generation really running on hope and the idea of enthusiasm and passionate interest in your government, and the violent ends for these men is tragic. Jack Kennedy, November 1963, Martin Luther King Jr., April 1968, and then right after that, Bobby Kennedy, shot and killed in California, the projected Democratic hopeful for the presidency. And this is a generation that kind of just crumples around that idea. Okay, we get to the summer riots, and specifically here we're talking about the riots at the Democratic Party convention in Chicago, right? We're supposed to be watching them nominate Hubert Humphrey inside the building, and instead the NBC coverage is like, outside's better. And what's going on outside? Vietnam protesters have got the cops sicked on them, and we are into a full-scale brawl. And if you're a person sitting at home in America, you're watching the TV going, what is this? This is not the country that I went to war for. This is not the country that I pay my taxes to support. This is not the America that I really believe in. And you know who's talking to you? Richard Nixon. Nixon in 1968, kind of flowing over the next piece of information here, campaigns to a group called the Silent Majority. Nixon believes that the average American doesn't burn a draft card, or a bra for that matter. They don't show up and protest in the streets. They don't violently try and overthrow the society. You know what they do? They pay their taxes, and they send their sons off to war. And they sit at home and probably eat their TV dinners, and they watch the Dick Van Dyke Show or something like that, and they sit there and they watch the news and they look at what's going on in Chicago and they shake their head. And Nixon in 1968 said, there's nothing wrong with this country that a good election can't fix. Let's have one. And what Nixon's saying is these last 8 years, the Kennedy-Johnson problem, that can go away. We can go back to core American values. We'll get out of Vietnam. We'll fix the problems of this society. We'll stop being the checkbook for the world, and we'll start fixing America. And we'll put ourselves back on a track towards prosperity and greatness. And using that message, Nixon's going to come out ahead in 1968. It's not a huge election victory, right? He only got about 43% of the popular vote. But it's a Nixon who believes in an America that people associate with the America of the 1950s, when Nixon was vice president and Eisenhower was president. More on Nixon in a moment. Have a good night.